In 1995, we paddled from Nain on the Labrador Coast to Kangiqsualujjuaq on Ungava Bay. Here's a map of Quebec and Labrador. The square marks the area we traveled. We paddled up the coast to Nachvak Fiord. We went into the fjord and then up the Korok River. We then portaged into the Korok River and then paddled down the river to Ungava Bay. We paddled along the bay to the community of Kangiqsualujjuaq at the mouth of the George River. We rented a van in Vermont, and our neighbors, Phil and Carolyn, volunteered to drive us for the 3-day trip to Goose Bay, Labrador. The Trans-Labrador Highway was pretty rough at the time. Here, I'm wiring a shock absorber back onto the van. Our friend Joe Gowdy invited us to camp in his yard. We had left our canoes in Goose Bay the previous year after finishing a trip on the Labrador Coast. Ann is doing some touch-up work on their canoe. I'm testing out some renovations to our spray skirts. We planned to take the coastal ferry up the coast to Nain, but the ice had come back in and the boat wasn't running. We got lucky, and with Joe Gowdy's help, we found a relatively inexpensive flight to Nain. Getting ready to leave Nain and head up the coast. Anne is giving an offering of tobacco as a sign of respect to the waters we would travel. The ice was a novelty at first. It soon became more serious as we had to figure out how to safely navigate it. We reached the point where we were going to have to leave the protection of the islands and face the open ocean. We scouted to see if we would be able to travel through the ice floes or if we needed to wait until the conditions were better for paddling. We decided we could find a way through the ice. One advantage of the ice is that it damped down the waves when we paddled in a headwind. If the day was warm and the wind was relatively quiet, the melting ice added a unique soundscape to our paddling. We had a spectacular campsite in the circle of the Kangiqsualujjuaq Mountains. We camped where the settlement of Okak used to be. All that's left is this cannon. We took a day off, and Dave caught some Arctic char.
Somebody made up a little fire
A little further up the coast, we reached the Korok Mountains. We had heard that there was a way to avoid several miles of the open sea by going into Lost Channel and doing a short portage. It was a portage we were all happy to do. It was a spooky morning with fog keeping our visibility down and sheer cliffs on the shoreline, leaving us nervous about finding shelter if the wind picked up. It was easy to imagine malevolent spirits lurking in the landscape. Being in such wide open country made estimating the scale of things pretty difficult. This ice floe kept looming larger and larger. If the wind was low and no easy landing places nearby, we sometimes had lunch in the boats. Group decision-making could be interesting. Here, we're trying to decide where to camp for the night.
Here or at Duncan Point. All those in favor of here.
Oh, this is a new style of boat.
Say aye.
Aye.
How many did we get?
That's why it's not a good way to do it.
Grunt. I heard a third, fourth grunt, I think.
Dick's abstaining.
No, he said aye.
I thought he said aye.
I said aye.
Okay, all those
said
who
aye.
want to camp at Duncan, say aye.
Aye. Oops,
Wait,
no,
you
that's-
voted twice.
You can't vote twice.
Did you vote twice, you little
did.
sneak?
Again.
We camped at Nachvak Bay. Like almost everywhere we camped along the coast, there were reminders of the earlier inhabitants. This area contained the remains of some very old sod houses. We stopped at the site of Hebron, an Inuit community established by the Moravians in 1831. It was abandoned in 1959 after epidemics of whooping cough, influenza, and smallpox ran through the community. We reached Nachvak Fiord. Once we crossed the fjord, we would be paddling by the Torngat Mountains. We camped on an island and contemplated the 6-mile crossing of open water to reach the other side. There was a lot of interesting geology along the coast. There was a dark black vein of rock that was visible for several miles. This is one of our first campsites in the Torngat Mountains. We took a day off to hike the surrounding hills. We wouldn't have been surprised to see a woolly mammoth appear in one of the valleys. Sunrise on the Labrador Sea. We entered Ungava Bay, which is the site of a chert quarry that goes back at least 7,000 years. We were greeted by some not very shy caribou and a waterfall whose flow depended on the air temperature, since its source was glacial meltwater. The flow would be at a minimum in the morning and at its peak in the evening. We took a few days off to go hiking. We climbed above our campsite to get a view of the country. The chert quarry was a little bit to our east. We walked down the bay a bit and hiked up the hills for the day. We left Ungava Bay and paddled up the coast and around Gulch Cape. When we stopped to camp, we found a number of old tent rings with cooking hearths and meat caches. We also found thousands of pieces of Rama chert, which were obviously flakes from tool-making activities.
Obviously been struck. That's what I...
This piece.
The next day, we entered Nachvak Fiord. We were paddling in the middle of the Torngats. We camped partway down the fjord. A minke whale was patrolling just offshore. A short distance from where we camped, we found an old grave consisting of rocks on top of the ground. There were human bones in the grave. On the following day, we paddled down the fjord to the mouth of the McCormack River, a small stream that flows out of the heart of the Torngats. 4 of us hiked up the valley of the McCormack to hike for a few days.
I'm not going to.
We had some company on our hike. We found a good place to camp with a great view looking back to Nachvak Fiord. Early the next morning, we started off on a hike. I thought we were just going to hike up a few valleys, but we kept climbing and climbing.
That'll be the other. We'll go right into that big wall. we'll go around there. But we'll have to stay to the right of this next lake.
At one point, we were scrambling along on loose rocks that sloped steeply into a partially frozen lake. I vowed that whatever we ended up doing that day, I wasn't going to return to our camp over that same route. We found ourselves on a knife edge with a glacier far below on one side and a frozen lake on the other. I'm afraid of heights. Dick, considerately, didn't film me when I was crawling for part of the traverse. I'm not sure how I ended up going up a rock face. Dick found a good, if sometimes terrifying, way down the mountain. Some caribou appeared out of the mist on the descent. We came to a stream that had been easy to cross in the morning. The snowmelt made it more challenging to cross in the evening. After returning to Nachvak Fiord, we paddled down the Talak arm to get to the mouth of the Palmer River. The next morning, we started up the Palmer. At first, tracking upstream was fairly easy. As the gradient became steeper, going upstream became more difficult. We used a combination of tracking, wading, and paddling to make progress. The scenery was spectacular, but the weather was bad for a few days. Cold rain and wind are not ideal conditions for traveling upstream. When one side of the stream became more difficult, we would ferry to the other side. As we neared the top of the watershed, portaging became the only option. Here we portaged for most of a day to get to the final pond before crossing the height of land into the Korok. This is our last campsite before the long portage to the Korok. A curious bear paid us a visit the next morning. The portage took us about a day and a half. We camped partway through. As we neared the height of land between the Labrador Sea and Ungava Bay, we took a moment to commemorate the occasion.
This is day 32 of our 42-day trip from the village of Maine on the Labrador Coast to Ungava Bay. We're at the height of land and we're heading for the Korok River. We've snagged peaks, almost died on mountaintops, had great food, and we're all having a wonderful time.
We reached the Korok River. The rapids were pretty bony at first, but we were able to run most of them. We reach Kangiqsualujjuaq Falls and take a few days off. Caribou were crossing the river just above the falls. Keep your eye on the calf. We were afraid she would be swept downstream and over the falls. The char were heading upriver. As we went downriver, the rapids became larger. We had 3 days of heavy rain that kept us in camp. On the third morning, the water had risen almost to our tents, so we set off on the swollen river. We lined a drop that would have been an easy run at normal water levels. We portaged this rapid. After a long and wet day, we found a good place to camp and built a cooking fire and a drying fire.
I tried to avoid looking out in the middle.
At one point I just stopped and
We're near the mouth of the river. We're on Ungava Bay now. Our last campsite. We portage over the rocks to avoid the wide mud flats created by the 30 to 40 foot tides. Arriving at Kangiqsualujjuaq. We get a ride and a place to stay overnight until our flight out the next day.
she's not there.
Oh, okay. So do you think we could borrow pots to cook with?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's all right.
Okay.
And we won't need to borrow those, bring the whole
Great,
wagon.
we're all
We'll not bring what we need.
The food.
Yeah.
All you need is your
At the airport, waiting for a flight to Kangiqsualujjuaq, then on to Montreal.